When I walked through the courtroom doors, I felt every eye on me, piercing like needles. The air was charged, thick, almost suffocating. My son Julian sat next to his attorney in a gray suit that probably cost more than I spent in an entire month when he was a child. Beside him, Andrea, my daughter-in-law, wore an ivory dress she had surely chosen with care to look like the perfect victim of this whole ordeal. When she saw me enter, her eyes lifted towards the ceiling in that characteristic gesture of hers, that silent contempt she had perfected over the years. She rolled her eyes as if my mere presence were a personal offense, an inevitable nuisance on her perfect day. I heard an exaggerated sigh escape her lips, painted a coral shade that contrasted sharply with the artificial pallor of her face. Julian didn't even look at me. He kept his gaze fixed on the papers in front of him, as if I were transparent, as if I didn't exist. That indifference hurt more than any insult could. If you're watching this video, please like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching my story of revenge from. I want to know how far it has reached. I walked slowly down the central aisle, feeling the weight of my 66 years not in my bones, but in my heart. Each step echoed in the expectant silence of the room. I wore a simple, neutral-colored suit, nothing ostentatious, nothing to draw attention. I never liked the noisy spotlight. I always preferred the silent power, the kind that doesn't need to shout to exist. I sat down in my spot, and that's when it happened. The judge entered the room, his black robe slightly billowing with his movement. He ascended the bench with that natural authority years of experience grant. He picked up the gavel, struck the wood once, and the sound resonated like contained thunder. He looked up to survey those present, making the routine visual sweep all judges perform before commencing. But when his eyes reached me, he stopped completely. His face changed in an instant. The professional, neutral expression transformed into something I couldn't immediately decipher. Surprise, perhaps respect. Definitely. His eyebrows went up, and I saw his fingers tighten around the gavel he held. There was an awkward silence, one of those silences that feel like hours but are only seconds. He tilted his head slightly, squinting as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing, and then he spoke. "Wait," he said in a measured, almost incredulous voice. "The accusations are against Ms. Davis?" He pronounced my adapted last name with a special weight, as if those two syllables held a meaning only he and I understood in that moment. "Veronica Davis." I watched Andrea exchange a confused look with Julian. He frowned, clearly annoyed by the interruption, by the tone of respect the judge had used with me. They didn't understand anything. They never understood anything. My son's lawyer quickly rose to his feet, nervously adjusting his burgundy tie. "Yes, Your Honor," he began in that practiced voice of someone who has rehearsed the same speech in front of a mirror. "We are here because my client, Mr. Julian Davis, the defendant's son, alleges that his mother, an elderly and possibly vulnerable woman, was manipulated by her late husband to inherit the entirety of the family's assets." He spoke of me as if I were a senile old woman, a fragile female incapable of independent thought. The judge didn't respond immediately. He looked at me again, this time with what seemed to be a mix of curiosity and something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. He rested his elbows on the desk and interlaced his fingers in front of his face, as if processing information that didn't square with what was before him. "Proceed," he finally said, though his voice was no longer as neutral as before. There was a different nuance, a caution that hadn't been there at the start. Andrea leaned toward Julian and whispered something I couldn't hear, but by the movement of her lips and the expression on her face, I knew she was upset, probably wondering why the judge had looked at me like that, why he had pronounced my name with such inexplicable reverence. She had always believed she controlled every situation, that her beauty and smooth talking were enough to get whatever she wanted. But in this courtroom, things didn't work the way they did at her superficial dinners with equally shallow friends. But for you to understand how I ended up here, how I ended up sitting in that courtroom accused by my own son of being a foolish, manipulative old woman, I need to take you back in time a little. I need you to see the complete story, not just this final chapter, because the truth is never in a single scene. The truth is built with years, with decisions, with silences that hurt more than words, with absences that weigh more than any presence. It all began many years ago when I was a completely different woman. Well, not that different, because essentially I was always the same, but circumstances molded me, broke me, and rebuilt me so many times that sometimes even I didn't recognize the woman I saw in the mirror. I was 24 when I met Oscar. He was 30, ambitious, smart, and he had those eyes that made you feel like you were the only person in the world when he looked at you. I was finishing my law studies. I was at the top of my class. That's not arrogance, it's a fact. My professor said I had a bright future, that I would go far, that my name would be etched in important legal rulings. I was passionate about every case, every law, every argument. I spent entire nights in the library surrounded by heavy books and legal cases that I found fascinating. I dreamed of being a judge someday, of dispensing justice, of defending those who had no voice. But then Julian came along. He wasn't planned, but he wasn't unwanted either. When I saw those 2 lines on the pregnancy test, I felt a mix of terror and excitement I'd never experienced before. Oscar was happy, genuinely happy. He hugged me and told me we'd be the best family in the world. And I believed him. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because at that moment, love made everything possible. I left the university 2 semesters short of graduating. 2 semesters, 6 months that separated me from the diploma I had pursued for years, from the future I had built with so much effort and sacrifice. But back then, it seemed like the right decision. Oscar was building his company, working 18 hours a day, and someone had to be home preparing the nest for our son. That someone was me. I didn't regret it then, I really didn't. When Julian was born, with his enormous eyes and perfect little hands, I felt that everything had been worth it. I held him in my arms and saw in him a new purpose, a different mission, but one just as important. Being a mother, I thought, was the noblest profession there was, and in many ways it is. But no one tells you the price you pay for that nobility. Oscar fulfilled his promise to get rich. In 5 years, his import company was already bringing in millions of dollars annually. We bought a huge house in the best neighborhood in town, with gardens that looked like they were straight out of a magazine and a pool that shimmered like a mirror under the sun. We had 3 cars, staff, a life that looked perfect from the outside, and in many ways it was. And Oscar loved me, I never doubted that. But there was something he didn't understand, something no man of his generation truly understood. I'd stopped being Veronica. I had become Oscar Davis's wife, Julian's mother, the perfect hostess for his business dinners. The woman who smiled in the Society magazine photographs in a champagne-colored dress and a pearl necklace that weighed as much as my silence. When someone asked me what I did, I replied that I was a homemaker, and I watched their eyes immediately lose interest as if I had said I did nothing at all. I truly wonder, if you were in my place, what would you do? Would you choose to be quiet to maintain peace, or would you dare to face everything to reclaim your voice? I want to know your opinion, because every story is like a candle that can light the way for someone else. Julian grew up spoiled. That's also a fact, not an opinion. We gave him everything he asked for and more than he needed. Imported toys, annual trips to Disney World, designer clothes, the best private school in the city. We thought that was how love was shown. How wrong we were. Love isn't measured in dollars or in gifts wrapped in shiny paper. It's measured in time, in presence, in real conversations. But by the time you realize that, sometimes it's already too late. By the time he was 16, Julian was already talking to me in that condescending tone that would later become his usual way of addressing me. "Mom, you don't understand how the world works," he'd tell me when I tried to advise him on something. "Mom, that was then. Things have changed." As if my 40-something years had turned me into a relic of the past, someone whose opinions no longer held value. And I stayed quiet, swallowing my words, because I didn't want to create conflict, because good mothers don't argue with their children, because I had learned to keep the peace at any cost. Oscar worked so much that I barely saw him. He came home late, ate dinner quickly, reviewed papers, and fell asleep in front of the TV. On weekends, he played golf with his partners or attended corporate events where I accompanied him like an elegant but dispensable accessory. Our conversations became transactional. "I need you to pick this up. Don't forget that." The bank called about the other thing. We became logistical partners, not spouses. But there was one person in that family who did see me. Gilbert, Oscar's father. He looked me in the eye when he talked to me. He asked real questions and expected real answers. Gilbert had been a lawyer all his life. He had retired at 65 with an impeccable reputation and a mind still sharp as a scalpel. He was a tall man with broad shoulders that the years hadn't managed to completely stoop, with silver hair combed back and large hands that always held a book or a newspaper. He came to the house every Sunday for lunch. It was the only family tradition that remained intact. And while Oscar took calls and Julian locked himself in his room with his video games, Gilbert and I would sit in the garden drinking coffee. We talked about everything: politics, history, legal case that came up in the news. He told me anecdotes from his years in the courts, about impossible cases he had won, about injustices he had corrected. One Sunday, I was 42 and particularly melancholy. Gilbert asked me something no one else had bothered to ask in years. "Veronica," he said, stirring the sugar in his cup, "you studied law, didn't you?" It wasn't a question, it was an affirmation. He knew the answer. I nodded silently, feeling something tighten in my throat. "And why did you stop?" he then asked, looking at me with those eyes that saw too much. I shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "For Julian," I replied. "Someone had to raise him." Gilbert placed his cup on the table with more force than necessary. The sound echoed in the silence of the garden. "Veronica," he said, his voice firm but not harsh. "Raising a child is important, but losing yourself in the process is not." I stared at him, not knowing how to respond. No one had ever said anything like that to me before. No one had validated that feeling of emptiness I had spent years trying to ignore. "You had dreams," he continued. "You had a bright future, and you traded it for this." He made a sweeping gesture with his hand, encompassing the house, the garden, that entire life of appearances I had built. "I'm not saying it's wrong," he added quickly, "but tell me the truth. Are you happy?" The question landed on me like a stone. "Are you happy, Veronica?" 4 simple words no one had asked me in decades. I opened my mouth to give the usual lie. "Yes, of course, I'm happy. I have everything a woman could wish for." But the words didn't come out. Instead, I felt my eyes fill with tears I'd held back for years. Gilbert didn't say anything else. He just reached his hand across the table and covered mine with it. That simple gesture, that human contact full of understanding, broke something inside me. It was in that moment, in that garden bathed in the afternoon sun with the scent of the flowers I had planted, myself floating in the air, that I made a decision, not immediately, not dramatically, but a seed was planted within me that day, a seed that, over time, would grow into the woman who would sit in that courtroom years later, facing her own son. 3 months after that conversation with Gilbert, Julian turned 23 and announced that he had a girlfriend. Her name was Andrea. She worked as a publicist for an events company, and, according to him, she was the most incredible woman he had ever met. He brought her to dinner one Friday night. I remember that day perfectly because it was the first time I felt that chill of warning that I would later learn not to ignore. Andrea arrived in an emerald dress that fit her body like a second skin, towering heels that made her look taller than she was, and a perfume so intense you smelled it before you saw her enter. She had perfectly straightened brown hair falling over her shoulders, red lips that smiled too much, and eyes that analyzed everything with the precision of someone calculating the value of every object in the room. "Mrs. Davis," she said, shaking my hand with a brief, cold grip, "it's a pleasure to finally meet you. Julian has told me so much about you." A lie, I knew it instantly. Julian barely spoke of me to his friends, much less to his girlfriends. But Andrea had that special talent for saying exactly what people wanted to hear, even if her eyes said something completely different. During dinner, she monopolized the conversation. She talked about her job, the exclusive events she organized, the important people she knew, the expensive places she had been. Every sentence was a display of status, a reminder that she moved in circles she considered superior. When Oscar mentioned his company, Andrea leaned forward with sudden interest, asking detailed questions about invoicing, investments, growth projections. I watched her in silence, cutting my food into small pieces that I barely tasted. I saw Julian look at her with those infatuated eyes, as if she were the 8th wonder of the world. He didn't see what I saw. He didn't see the naked ambition behind every smile, the calculating coldness behind every rehearsed compliment, or maybe he did see it and simply didn't care. Sometimes desire blinds more effectively than any blindfold. "And what about you, Mrs. Davis?" Andrea suddenly asked, turning her attention to me like a spotlight finally finding its forgotten target. "What do you do?" The question was loaded with that fake curiosity that polite people use when they really aren't interested in the answer. "I'm a homemaker," I replied with the same phrase I had repeated thousands of times. "Oh," she said, and I watched her interest die instantly. "How lovely. Someone has to take care of the home, right?" The tone wasn't exactly derogatory, it was worse. It was condescending, as if she were speaking to someone who had chosen a small, unimportant life. Gilbert, who was sitting next to me, squeezed his napkin tightly. I noticed it out of the corner of my eye. He had also picked up on the veiled insult. "Veronica was one of the best law students of her generation," he said, his voice calm but firm. "She gave up her career to raise Julian." Andrea blinked, surprised for a second before regaining her perfect smile. "Oh, what a sacrifice," she said without a hint of sincerity. "But you know, those were different times. Now women don't have to choose between career and family. We can have it all." The implication was clear. I had been weak, old-fashioned, complacent. She was the modern woman, the one who did know how to balance everything. How easy it is to judge when you haven't lived the other person's circumstances. Julian and Andrea got married 8 months later in an ostentatious ceremony that cost more than $50,000. Andrea insisted on every detail, from the imported flowers to the designer dress that Oscar paid for without batting an eye. I helped with the preparations, of course. I made calls, coordinated vendors, solved last-minute problems. Andrea barely thanked me. To her, I was simply part of the support staff, someone whose job was to make her perfect day happen without a hitch. On the wedding day, as I watched my son recite his vows, looking at Andrea as if she were the only thing that mattered in the universe, I felt a profound sadness I couldn't name then. It wasn't just losing my son, which is what all mothers feel when their children marry. It was something darker, more definitive. It was seeing him choose to reproduce exactly the same mistakes Oscar and I had made. He chose a beautiful and ambitious woman, ignoring whether there was substance behind the facade. He chose shine over depth. After the wedding, visits became sparse. Julian and Andrea moved into a luxurious apartment downtown, decorated by a famous interior designer with furniture that cost more than a car. The first few weeks, they called often. They came to lunch on Sundays, but gradually the calls became less frequent. Lunches were canceled with last-minute excuses. "We're too busy. We have a commitment." Something came up at work. The only times the phone rang regularly was when they needed something. Money, almost always. "Mom, I need you to help me with this. Mom, could you talk to Dad about that? Andrea's business isn't doing so well. We need a loan. The car broke down. We need help with the down payment for the new one." Every call was a transaction. Never let a real conversation. They never asked how I was, what I was doing, if I needed anything. Oscar gave them the money without asking questions. He's 25 and he'd tell me when I suggested maybe we should set boundaries. He's establishing himself. He needs support. But I saw something different. I saw a man trying to buy his son's love with signed checks. I saw a son who had learned that his parents were an emotional ATM he could access whenever he needed it. Gilbert noticed it too. "You're creating a monster," he told Oscar one Sunday during lunch. Julian wasn't there, of course. He had canceled again. My husband frowned, annoyed by the criticism. "It's my money, Dad. I can give it to whoever I want." Gilbert slowly shook his head. "It's not about the money, son. It's about what you're teaching him. You're teaching him that everything can be solved with money, that there are no consequences for his decisions, that there will always be someone to bail him out." The argument escalated quickly. Oscar stood up, throwing his napkin onto the table. "I'm not going to take parenting lessons from anyone," he said in a harsh voice. "Not even from you." He left the dining room, leaving us in an awkward silence. Gilbert looked at me with those tired eyes that had seen too much. "I'm sorry, Veronica," he said softly. "I'm sorry my son didn't learn what I tried to teach him." That night, after Oscar fell asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of our bedroom. The house was in absolute silence. the kind of silence that amplifies your thoughts until they become deafening. I thought about all the years I'd dedicated to creating a family, to maintaining a home, to being the perfect wife and mother. And for what? To have a son who only called me when he needed money, and a husband who saw me as part of the house inventory. It was that night that I made the real decision, not the seed Gilbert had planted months ago, but the complete, firm, definitive decision. I was going to reclaim my life. I was going to finish what I had left incomplete 2 decades ago. I was 43. It wasn't too late. It couldn't be too late. The next morning, I called the university. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would jump out of my chest while I waited for them to answer. A secretary with a tired voice informed me that I would have to start almost from scratch. Too many years had passed, programs had changed, many of my subjects no longer counted. I would need at least 3 years to complete the degree. 3 years. At 43, most people would think that was crazy. I thought it was my last chance. I didn't tell Oscar immediately, nor Julian. First, I needed to be sure. I needed to have everything planned. I spent weeks researching, consulting programs, calculating schedules. Classes were in the evening from 4 to 8 p.m. I could do it. Oscar never got home before 9, and Julian no longer lived with us. No one had to find out until I was ready to tell them. Gilbert was the first to know. He came over one Sunday and found me surrounded by university brochures that I quickly hid under a magazine when I heard his car arrive. But he was too observant. "What are you hiding there, Veronica?" he asked with a smile that indicated he already knew. I sighed and showed him the papers. His eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen before. "That's the best news I've heard in years," he said. And then he added something that would change everything. "I'll pay your tuition." I tried to refuse, of course. "I can't accept that, Gilbert, and it's too much." He raised a hand to silence me. "Veronica, I'm 72 and have more money than I could ever spend in the rest of my life. Let me invest it in something that really matters. Let me invest it in you." There was so much genuine affection in his words, so much faith, that I felt tears starting to well up in my eyes. "This will be our secret," he said, winking at me. "For now." I enrolled a week later. On the first day of class, I felt ridiculous. I was 43 and surrounded by 20-year-olds who looked at me as if I were their lost mother wandering the campus. Some professors also looked at me with curiosity, wondering what a woman my age was doing there. But something extraordinary happened when classes began. I discovered that my mind was still as sharp as before, sharper even because now I had life experience to give context to every legal theory. The cases we analyzed were no longer abstract to me. When we studied family law, I thought of all the couples I knew trapped in unhappy marriages. When we looked at wills and estates, I remembered the fights I had witnessed in families known for money and property. Every class was a revelation. Every book was a door open into a world I had forgotten existed. Oscar found out after 2 months. He came home early one night, and I wasn't there. I'd left his dinner prepared as always, but my absence disconcerted him. When I arrived at 8:30 with my books under my arm, he was sitting in the living room with a glass of whiskey waiting for me. "Where were you?" he asked. He didn't sound angry, just confused. "At the university," I replied. "I decided to finish my degree." There was a long silence. He looked at me as if I had said I had decided to join the circus. "Why?" he finally asked. The question hurt me more than he imagined. "Because I need something that is mine, Benison," I answered. "Something that isn't just being your wife or Julian's mother. I need to be Veronica again." I expected resistance. I expected him to tell me it was foolish, that it was pointless at my age. But Oscar surprised me. "All right," he said after a moment. "If that's what you want, all right." It wasn't enthusiastic support, but it wasn't an obstacle either. It was neutral, resigned acceptance, as if he were saying, "Do what you want as long as it doesn't interfere with my life." And that was exactly what I planned to do. Not interfere, not cause problems, just reclaim the part of me I had buried under 2 decades of domesticity. Julian, on the other hand, didn't take it well when he finally found out. He came to visit us 3 months later, one of those rare occasions when he didn't need money. Andrea came with him wearing a salmon-colored ensemble that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in an entire year. I casually mentioned during dinner that I was studying. Julian stopped chewing and looked at me as if I had lost my mind. "Studying what?" he asked. Lawrence, I replied. I'm finishing in my degree. Andrea let out a laugh that she tried to disguise as a cough. Sorry, she said, sounding not sorry at all. I don't know, I find it curious. Why do you need a degree at your age? You're not going to work, are you? The question carried so much hidden venom that even Oscar noticed the tone. Andrea, he said in a low voice, that's not appropriate. She shrugged. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. It's a bit late for career changes, don't you think? Julian said nothing in my defense. He just kept eating, avoiding my gaze. That was the confirmation I needed. My own son thought the same as his wife. He thought I was too old, too irrelevant, too useless to have ambitions of my own. I calmly got up from the table. I picked up my plate, even though I had barely touched the food. Excuse me, I said. I have to study for an exam tomorrow. I left them in an awkward silence that didn't bother me at all. The next 2 years were the most intense of my life. I studied every afternoon, every night, every weekend. Gilbert became my confidant, my mentor, my biggest cheerleader. He came on Sundays and we discussed cases, reviewed legal concepts, debated interpretations of laws. He was genuinely thrilled with my progress. He lent me books from his personal library, some so old the pages crumbled at the touch. He told me stories from his years as a lawyer that didn't appear in any textbook. Oscar maintained his neutral distance. He didn't obstruct, but he didn't participate either. He never asked how I did on an exam. He never wanted to know what I was studying. It was as if he had decided to tolerate this new facet of me without truly seeing it. Julian and Andrea disappeared almost completely from our lives. They only called when they needed money, which was happening more and more often. Andrea's event company was in constant trouble. She always needed capital for this project or that important client. I graduated with honors at 46. The ceremony was small, modest, but for me it was the most important day of my life since Julian was born. Gilbert was in the front row, applauding with tears in his eyes. Oscar came too, sitting next to him, smiling politely, but not really understanding what that moment meant to me. Julian and Andrea sent a message. Congrats, Mom. Busy today. We'll celebrate later. That later never came, but I didn't need their validation. I had my degree, I had my recovered pride, and I had plans. Tell me whether you have parents, grandparents, or older family members who deserve more respect than they currently receive from their families. Alternatively, tell me if you yourself are going through a situation in which you're not appreciated as much as you truly deserve. Gilbert helped me secure an internship at a respectable law firm in Manhattan. Nothing ostentatious, nothing too attention-grabbing. I didn't want the spotlight. I just wanted to practice, learn, grow. I worked part-time, 3 days a week. It was enough to keep me busy without completely neglecting the house. Although honestly, I no longer cared so much if the house was perfect or not. I discovered that I was good, very good. The firm's partners started assigning me more complex cases. My age, which Andrea had considered a disadvantage, turned out to be my greatest asset. Clients trusted me. They saw me as maternal, trustworthy, wise. They didn't know that inside, I felt like that 24-year-old girl who had abandoned her dreams, finally having the opportunity to live them. Gilbert was proud. I saw it in his eyes every time we talked about my work. I knew you'd do it, he'd constantly tell me. I always knew you were special, Veronica. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Those words meant more to me than any professional recognition. 3 years after graduating, when I was 49, something happened that would change everything forever. Gilbert suffered a massive stroke while reading in his study. He was found 2 hours later, unconscious in his favorite armchair with a philosophy book open on his lap. He was rushed to the hospital, where he remained in a coma for 4 days that felt like 4 years. I went every day, sat by his bed, held his hand, and told him about my cases, about the small victories he celebrated so much. Oscar went too, of course. He was his father, but there was a difference in how each of us processed the situation. Oscar stayed 10 minutes, looked at the monitors with a worried expression, talked to the doctors about prognoses and treatments, and then left for work because business couldn't wait. I stayed for hours talking to Gilbert as if he could hear me, because a part of me believed he could. Julian showed up on the second day, Andrea came with him wearing dark sunglasses even though we were inside the hospital, as if the drama of the situation required accessories. "How long does he have, Van?" Julian asked, without even greeting me first. "We don't know," I replied, feeling rage starting to build in my chest. "It's not a matter of time, it's a matter of waiting to see what happens." Andrea looked at her watch, a gold Rolex that shone obscenely under the fluorescent lights. "We have an important dinner tonight," she murmured to Julian. "We can't stay long." They stayed exactly 15 minutes. Julian stood by his grandfather's bed, not touching him, not speaking to him, just looking at him as if he were a problem that needed to be resolved quickly. Andrea didn't even approach. She stayed by the door checking her phone. When they left, they promised to come back soon. They didn't return until the funeral. Gilbert woke up on the 5th day, opening his eyes slowly, confused, disoriented. I was there, holding his hand. "Veronica," he whispered in a raspy voice, "you always knew how to stay." Those words broke me. I leaned down and kissed his forehead, feeling tears run down my cheeks. The doctor said it had been a miracle that men his age rarely recovered from such severe strokes. But Gilbert was strong, stubborn. He wasn't ready to go yet. The following months were a slow recovery. Gilbert lost mobility on his left side. His speech became slower, more labored, but his mind remained intact, bright as ever. I hired nurses to care for him. I made sure he had everything he needed. Oscar paid the medical bills without complaining, but rarely visited. He was busy, always busy. Julian didn't show up once during those months of rehabilitation. One afternoon, 6 months after the stroke, Gilbert asked me to take him to his study. He wanted to talk to me alone. I helped him sit in his armchair, the same one where he had collapsed. He opened a drawer of his desk with his good hand and pulled out a manila envelope. "Take this," he said, extending it toward me. I looked at him, not understanding. "What is this?" "Open it," he replied with a tired smile. Inside were legal documents, many documents. My name appeared over and over. Gilbert had amended his will. He was leaving me his complete library, all his law books he had collected over 50 years of his career. He was leaving me $500,000 so I could establish my own law firm if I wished. He was leaving me his contacts, his archived cases, his complete professional legacy. "I can't accept this," I said, feeling my voice break. "You have a son, you have a grandson." Gilbert slowly shook his head. "Oscar has his own fortune. He doesn't need mine. And Julian, well," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Julian learned to value money, but he never learned to value knowledge, character, real legacy. You do. You understand what truly matters. That's why I want you to be the one to continue what I started." He took my hand with his trembling one. "Promise me you won't waste this gift, Veronica. Promise me you'll be the brilliant lawyer I always knew you were." I promised him. How could I not promise him? This man had believed in me when no one else did. He had invested in me when my own family ignored me. I owed him everything. But there was something else in that envelope, a letter written in his trembling handwriting. It must have taken him hours to complete. I read it with tears falling onto the paper. The letter said, "Beautiful, painful, true things." It told me I had been the daughter he always wanted to have, that he was proud of me in ways he had never been proud of his own son, even though he loved Oscar with all his heart. It told me he had seen how I'd sacrificed myself, how I'd lost myself, and how I had finally found myself again. It told me not to let anyone, not even my own family, extinguish that light that had reignited within me. The letter ended with a line I still remember word for word. "The true legacy is not the money you leave. It is the difference you make in the lives you touch." Gilbert passed away 3 weeks after giving me that letter. He died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by his beloved books. The funeral was large because he had been a respected man in the legal community. Judges, lawyers, professors, old clients, everyone came to pay their respects. They all shared stories about how Gilbert had helped them, inspired them, guided them. I remained silent during the ceremony, containing a pain that was so profound I had no words to express it. Julian arrived late for the funeral, of course. Andrea accompanied him, wearing a tight black dress that was too revealing for a funeral, but she never understood the concept of appropriate. They stood at the back, whispering to each other, checking their phones. When the ceremony ended, Julian approached Oscar. "We need to talk about Grandpa's will," he said, without even feigning sadness. "What did he leave me?" Oscar looked at him with an expression I couldn't decipher. Tiredness, perhaps disappointment. Definitely. "We'll see at the reading of the will," he replied. Julian wasn't satisfied. "But I have a right to know. I'm his only grandson." Oscar didn't respond. He simply walked away from Julian, leaving the words hanging in the air. The reading of the will was a week later. Gilbert's lawyer, an older man named Avon who had been his partner for decades, gathered us all in an office that smelled of old wood and antique books. Oscar was there, I was there, Julian and Andrea were there. Ivan opened the document with solemnity and began to read. Gilbert left the majority of his estate to Oscar, as expected. The house, the investments, the main bank accounts. But when Ivan read my name, the atmosphere in the room changed. "To my daughter-in-law, Veronica Davis, I leave my complete library, my collection of legal cases, and the sum of $500,000 for her to establish her own legal practice." There was a stunned silence. Julian stood up so quickly that his chair fell backward. "What?" he shouted. "That can't be legal. She's not blood family." Ivan looked at him with a cold expression he must have practiced over decades of dealing with disgruntled heirs. "Ms. Davis is family by marriage, and your grandfather had every right to leave his estate to whomever he wished. The will is completely legal and valid." Andrea leaned toward Julian, whispering furiously, "That's our money. It should be ours." "He never gave us anything because you never earned it," Oscar said, his voice low but firm. "My father gave that money to Veronica because she deserved it." Julian and Andrea stormed out of that office like hurricanes of contained rage. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't even look at me. They just left, leaving a trail of venom in the air. On the way home, Oscar drove in silence. I looked out the window, processing everything that had happened, everything Gilbert had given me, not just the money, but the recognition, the validation, the tangible proof that someone had seen my worth when I myself had stopped seeing it. "My father loved you very much," Oscar finally said, breaking the silence. "More than I understood, I think." His voice sounded strange, as if he were discovering something about himself he didn't like. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Gilbert had been more of a father to me in those last years than any other male figure in my life. He had seen my potential when my own husband only saw the woman who ironed his shirts. The following months were a silent transformation. I used Gilbert's money exactly as he had wanted. I established my own law office, not something or ostentatious, just a small office in a discreet downtown building. I hired an assistant, a young woman named Mariana, who reminded me of myself at that age, full of dreams and ambition. I started taking cases, small ones at first, then more complex ones. My specialty became family law and wills, estates. I knew that territory better than anyone. I had lived its tragedies from the inside. Oscar didn't say much about my new business. He accepted it with the same neutrality with which he had accepted everything else. But something had changed between us. There was a distance that hadn't existed before, or maybe it had always existed and I was only just noticing it. We ate dinner together in silence. We slept in the same bed without touching. We were two strangers sharing a space, nothing more. Julian and Andrea disappeared completely for almost a year. Not a call, not a visit, not even a message on my birthday. It was as if they had decided to punish me with their absence, without understanding that their absence was more of a gift than a punishment. For the first time in decades, I could breathe without feeling the weight of their expectations, their demands, their constant judgments. But peace never lasts forever. Oscar started feeling unwell one Tuesday afternoon. Chest pain, difficulty breathing. We thought it was indigestion, stress from work. He took an antacid and went to bed early. At 3 a.m, his groans woke me up. He was pale, sweating, clutching his chest with both hands. I called the ambulance. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes, which felt like 8 hours. "Massive heart attack," the doctor said at the hospital. "We need to operate immediately." I signed the papers with trembling hands. I watched them wheel him away on that gurney connected to machines that beeped and flashed. I called Julian. No answer. I left him a message. Your father is in the hospital. It's serious. Please come. 3 hours passed before he called me back. What happened? He asked in a sleepy, annoyed voice. It's 6 in the morning, Mom. Your father had a heart attack. He's in surgery right now. There was a pause. I'll be there in an hour, he finally said. But he didn't arrive in an hour. He arrived 4 hours later when Oscar was already out of danger, awake, weak, with tubes coming out of his body and monitors tracking every beat of his tired heart. Andrea came with him, of course, wearing ripped designer jeans and a lavender blouse that probably cost more than a nurse's monthly salary. How is he? Julian asked, looking at his father with an expression I didn't know if it was genuine concern or simple social obligation. Stable, I replied. The doctors say he was lucky. He'll need to completely change his lifestyle, reduce stress, eat better, exercise. Julian nodded distractedly. And the business, he asked. Who's going to run the company? There it was, the real question, the only one that truly mattered to him. That will be decided later, I said in a dry voice. Right now, the important thing is for your father to recover. Andrea approached Oscar, touching his hand with those perfectly manicured, nude-colored fingers. Mr. Davis, she said in a saccharine voice, you had us so worried. Oscar looked at her as if he were seeing right through her, seeing the falseness, the rehearsed performance. They stayed 20 minutes, then Julian said he had an important meeting he couldn't cancel. Andrea murmured something about a client who was waiting. They promised to return the next day. They didn't return. I stayed at the hospital day and night for a whole week. I slept in an uncomfortable chair next to Oscar's bed. I ate what I could from the vending machines. I showered in the visitor's restroom. I didn't care. He was my husband. I'd spent 30 years with him. I wasn't going to abandon him now. During those days and nights in the hospital, Oscar and I talked more than we had in years. Real, real, deep, painful conversations. He told me things he had never said. He told me he regretted letting me lose my dreams. He told me he had been an absent husband, a mediocre father. He told me Gilbert had been right about Julian, that they had created a spoiled, ungrateful son who only saw them as sources of resources. I love you, Veronica, he told me one night with tears in his eyes. I've always loved you, but I never knew how to love you the way you needed. I never truly saw you. Forgive me. I took his hand that had signed so many checks for our son, that had worked tirelessly to give us a comfortable life, that had never learned to express affection without an attached price. I forgive you, I told him. And it was true. I forgave him because I understood that he, too, had been a victim of his own limitations, of his own incomplete emotional education. Oscar left the hospital 2 weeks later. We arrived home and found that nothing had changed. The house was exactly as we had left it, clean and tidy thanks to the cleaning service we hired. But it felt different, colder, emptier, as if the heart attack had revealed something that had always been there, but we refused to see. This house is too big for the two of us, Oscar said, looking around. It always was. The following months were a slow recovery. Oscar followed the doctor's orders religiously. He stopped working 16 hours a day, delegated responsibilities, hired a general manager to handle the daily operations of his company. We started walking together in the mornings, half an hour, every day around the neighborhood. I cooked healthy meals, no salt, no fats, everything measured and weighed as if it were an exact science. Julian called occasionally, always asking about his father's health, always sliding in questions about the company, about the finances, about the future. Andrea sent text messages with heart emojis and empty phrases about hope and recovery. Neither of them came to visit us during those months. They were busy, always busy, with their own unspecified problems that always implied a need for money. One afternoon, almost 6 months after the heart attack, Oscar called me into his study. He had papers scattered on his desk, legal documents I recognized immediately. My will, he said without preamble. I need to amend it. I sat down across from him, waiting. I want to leave you everything, Veronica. The company, the properties, the investments, everything. You're the only person in my life who never asked me for anything. the only one who stayed when there was nothing to gain by staying. I tried to protest. Julian is your son. He has a right. Oscar shook his head firmly. Julian will have what I decide he should have, nothing more. And I decided that what he should have is a lesson, not a fortune. I'll leave him enough to live comfortably if he learns to manage it. But the bulk of my estate goes to you. You deserve it. You earned it with every year you spent sacrificing yourself for this family. I didn't know what to say. A part of me felt it was right that after everything I had given, I deserved something in return. Another part of me feared Julian's reaction, the inevitable conflict this would cause. Oscar saw my doubt. Veronica, he said, taking my hands in his, for once in your life, accept something without feeling guilty. You have spent decades taking care of everyone but yourself. Let me do this. Let me show you that I finally understood. I nodded with tears in my eyes. All right, I whispered. Do what you think is right. Oscar smiled, a sad but genuine smile. He called Ivan, the same lawyer who had handled Gilbert's will. A week later, the documents were signed, notarized, filed. I was the universal heir to everything Oscar Davis had built during his life. Julian would receive $250,000, enough to start something of his own if he had the discipline to do so. Andrea received nothing. She was not blood family according to the will. I never imagined I would have to use those documents so soon. Oscar seemed to be improving. He was healthier, happier, more present than ever. We talked about future plans, about traveling together, about seeing places we had always postponed, about building a second phase of our marriage, a better, more conscious one. But fate had other plans. Oscar suffered a second heart attack one Tuesday morning while we were having coffee in the garden. One moment he was smiling, telling me an anecdote about a new employee. The next, he was clutching his chest and falling out of his chair. I called the ambulance. I screamed his name. I tried to remember the resuscitation techniques I had seen in movies, but it was no use. By the time the paramedics arrived, Oscar was gone. Oscar's funeral was even larger than Gilbert's. Business owners, partners, employees, clients. Everyone came to pay their respects to the man who had built an empire from scratch. I sat in the front row, dressed in black, my heart so numb I couldn't even cry. I had cried so much in the previous days that I had no tears left. There was only a deep emptiness, a feeling that everything I had known for 30 years had just vanished. Julian sat next to me with Andrea. For the first time in years, my son hugged me when he saw me. It was a brief, awkward hug, but it was more physical contact than we had had in a decade. I'm so sorry, Mom, he whispered, his voice cracking. Me too, I replied, and it was true. I didn't just regret Oscar's death, I regretted everything we hadn't been, everything we could have been if we had made different decisions. During the wake, Andrea clung to me like she never had before. She brought me water, asked if I needed anything, touched my arm with gestures that pretended to be comforting. It was so fake, it was almost comical, but I was too tired to confront her, too emotionally exhausted to point out her hypocrisy. I simply nodded and murmured thank you as I looked at the closed casket where the man with whom I had spent half my life lay. After the funeral, Ivan asked me to see him in his office. It's about Mr. Davis's will, he said in a professional but kind voice. We need to have the official reading. We scheduled the appointment for a week later, time that was supposedly to allow the family to process the grief. But I knew it was to allow people to prepare for the inevitable fight over money that would come. During that week, Julian visited me 3 times. 3 times in 1 week when he had gone months without seeing me. He came with different pretexts. He wanted to make sure I was okay. He needed some papers of his father's. He wanted to talk about the funeral arrangements. But I saw through every excuse. He was nervous, anxious, calculating how much he would receive from his father's inheritance. Andrea was less subtle. On their 3rd visit, while we were having tea in the living room, she dropped the question as if it were nothing. Mrs. Davis, she said in a sweet, false voice, do you have any idea how Oscar left his affairs? Just so we can be prepared, to know how to proceed with the company and all that. I looked her straight in the eye. Oscar left everything in order, I replied without giving more details. Everything will be clarified at the reading of the will. I saw her jaw tighten slightly, the only sign of frustration on her perfectly made-up face. Of course, she said, forcing a smile. We just wanted to help, you know? These processes can be complicated and you don't have business experience. The condescension in her voice was so obvious it almost made me laugh. I don't have business experience, I thought, but I have a law degree and years of experience navigating estate cases much more complex than this. But I didn't say anything. I let her think what she wanted. The day of the will reading arrived. We all gathered in the same office where we had read Gilbert's will years ago. Ivan was behind his desk with the documents in front of him. Julian was seated with his hands clasped, anxious. Andrea was next to him with a smile that was meant to be appropriate but didn't reach her eyes. I was in the other chair, calm, knowing what was coming but not gloating about it. Ivan opened the envelope and began to read in that monotonous voice lawyers use for legal documents. First were the small things, donations to charity, gifts to loyal employees, administrative details. Julian shifted impatiently in his chair, waiting to hear his name, waiting to hear the amount that would change his life forever. Finally, Ivan reached the main part. To my son, Julian Davis, I leave the sum of $250,000 with the hope that he will learn to value the work and discipline required to build something meaningful. There was a silence. $250,000? Julian repeated slowly, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Only $250,000 out of a fortune of millions, Ivan continued unmoved. The rest of my estate, including the Davis Imports Company, all properties, investments, and bank accounts, I leave in its entirety to my wife, Veronica Davis, who has been my loyal partner for 30 years and who deserves the financial security I did not always provide her emotionally. The silence that followed was deafening. Julian stood up so violently that his chair tipped over. "This is a joke," he screamed. "It has to be a joke. She manipulated him. It's obvious. An old woman who didn't even finish college until a few years ago, who never worked a real day in her life, and suddenly she gets everything." Ivan looked at him with an impassive expression. "Your father was in full possession of his mental faculties when he made this will. It was his completely voluntary decision. The will is legally sound." Andrea had also stood up. Her face, normally controlled and perfect, was red with rage. "This isn't gonna stand," she said, her voice trembling. "We're going to contest this will. We're going to prove that she manipulated him, that she took advantage of his vulnerability after the heart attack. No judge is going to allow a woman who did nothing but cook and clean to keep an empire she didn't build." I slowly, calmly stood up. "You can try whatever you want," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "But the will is legal, valid, and incontestable." Oscar knew exactly what he was doing. Andrea let out a humorless laugh full of venom. "Please, you have no idea how to run a company. You're going to ruin everything Oscar built in less than a year. The best option is for you to transfer control to us, who know how real business works." There it was, the real motive behind all that fake concern, all those condolence messages, all those visits during the funeral week. They didn't care about Oscar. They didn't care about me. They just wanted the money, the power, the control. They had been waiting for this moment, planning their move, calculating how to take what legally belonged to me. Julian took a step toward me. His face was transformed by rage. I no longer recognized the child I'd carried in my arms, who I'd fed and cared for. That child had turned into a stranger consumed by greed. "I'm not going to let you get away with this," he hissed. "I'm going to fight this until the end. I'm going to prove you manipulated my father, that you took advantage of a sick, vulnerable man." "Do it," I replied, looking him straight in the eyes. "Take me to court if that's what you want, but be prepared to lose because I didn't manipulate anyone. Your father made this decision after years of seeing who truly cared about him and who only cared about his money. After years of seeing who was present and who only showed up when they needed something." Andrea grabbed Julian's arm. "Let's go," she said. "It's pointless talking to her. She's clearly enjoying this. Let's get a lawyer and settle this the right way." They left the office, leaving a trail of threats and promises of legal warfare. The door closed behind them with a slam that shook the walls. I sat down again, feeling the weight of what had just happened. Ivan looked at me with a sympathetic expression. "I'm sorry, Veronica," he said. "I know this isn't the way you wanted things to turn out." I shook my head. Don't apologize. Oscar knew exactly what he was doing. He knew this would happen and he still made this decision. I have to respect that. 2 weeks later, I received the lawsuit papers. Julian and Andrea were suing me for undue influence, alleging that I had manipulated Oscar when he was in a vulnerable mental state. After his heart attack, they demanded that the will be invalidated and the assets distributed according to intestate succession laws, which meant Julian would receive half of everything as the sole child. I read the documents with professional calm, analyzing every argument, every allegation. They were weak, predictable, easy to refute. But I knew this wasn't about the legal strength of their case. It was about pressure, about making me feel guilty, about betting that I would give in to avoid the public scandal of a legal battle against my own son. But they had miscalculated. I was no longer the woman who yielded to keep the peace. I was no longer the one who swallowed her words to avoid conflict. I hired the best litigation lawyer I could find. His name was Marcus, and he was 58, had an impeccable reputation, and a 92% win rate in estate cases. We met in my office. I spread all the documents over my desk and told him the entire story without omitting anything, every painful detail, every abandonment, every call that only came when they needed money. Marcus listened attentively, taking occasional notes, nodding at the right moments. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with a thoughtful expression. "Veronica," he said, "this case is solid. The will was executed with all legal formalities. Oscar was in full possession of his faculties, and we have medical documentation to prove it. Plus, I understand you're a lawyer." I nodded. "I specialize in family law and wills/estates." A slow smile spread across his face. "Then you understand exactly how weak your son's case is. They're betting you'll be intimidated, that you won't want to go through the public scandal. But if you're willing to fight, we'll demolish them in court." The word demolish felt strong, almost violent, but there was a certain justice in it, too. They had chosen this path. They had decided to turn the pain of losing Oscar into a legal battle. I was simply going to defend myself. We spent the following weeks preparing the case. We gathered evidence, phone records showing Julian's lack of communication with me for years, except when he needed money. Bank transfers documenting every loan, every payment, every financial rescue Oscar had made. Testimonies from company employees confirming that I had been present at the hospital every day during Oscar's recovery while Julian barely showed up. We also had something more powerful, Oscar's complete medical history. Psychological evaluations done after his heart attack, confirming he was mentally competent, lucid, capable of making complex decisions. We even had a video recording Oscar had insisted on making when he signed the will, explaining his reasons in his own voice, with his own words. In that video, Oscar looked tired but resolute. "My son Julian will receive $250,000, he said, looking directly at the camera. "It's a generous amount that will allow him to start his own path if he learns discipline and work. But the rest of my estate goes to my wife, Veronica, who sacrificed her career to raise our son, who stood by me in my worst moments, who never asked me for anything, but deserves everything." When I saw that video for the first time, I cried. I cried for the man Oscar had been, and for the man he finally became in his last months. I cried for the lost years and for the final moments that were genuine. I cried because in that video, I saw the love that had always been there, but which neither of us had known how to express correctly until it was almost too late. Meanwhile, Julian and Andrea hired their own lawyers, an expensive, aggressive firm known for winning difficult cases through intimidation tactics. They started a smear campaign. They leaked information to the press about the millionaire's widow who had manipulated her dying husband. Some tabloids published articles with sensational headlines: "Uneducated homemaker inherits business empire. Disinherited son fights for justice." My clients began asking me about the articles. Some were concerned, others curious. Mariana, my assistant, was furious. "How dare they?" she said, reading the articles on her phone. "This is pure defamation. We should sue them too." I calmly quieted her. "Let them," I said. "When we get to court, the truth will come out. Lies only work when there's no evidence to contradict them." But the smear campaign did have an effect. Some clients canceled their cases with me, saying they didn't want to be associated with public scandals. Some acquaintances stopped returning my calls. The neighborhood where I had lived for years suddenly felt hostile, full of curious stares and whispers behind my back. It was as if I had done something wrong, as if defending what legally belonged to me were a crime. I received anonymous calls in the middle of the night, distorted voices telling me to give up the inheritance, to leave what wasn't mine, that a woman like me didn't deserve so much money. Some messages were more specific, threatening to expose secrets that didn't exist, promising to ruin my professional reputation. I changed my phone number twice. I installed security cameras at my house. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely afraid. Marcus assured me that this was normal in high-profile cases. They're trying to break you emotionally before you get to court, he explained. If they get you to give up, they win without even fighting. But if you stand firm, if you show them they won't intimidate you, they'll eventually realize they're going to lose. So I stood firm. I kept working, kept living, kept preparing for the trial. The trial date was set for 6 months after the lawsuit. 6 months of constant attacks, endless stress, sleepless nights wondering if I was doing the right thing. 6 months of questioning whether it was worth fighting, whether it wouldn't be easier to just divide the inheritance and end all this. But every time I considered giving up, I remembered Gilbert's words. The true legacy is not the money you leave. It is the difference you make in the lives you touch. Oscar had made a conscious decision. He had chosen to reward me for decades of sacrifice, of presence, of unconditional love that never expected anything in return. If I gave in now, if I let Julian and Andrea intimidate me into giving up that inheritance, I would be saying Oscar was wrong. I would be saying my sacrifice was worth nothing, and that was something I couldn't do. A week before the trial, Andrea tried one last move. She called me directly, bypassing the lawyers. "Mrs. Davis," she said in a voice that was meant to be conciliatory, "we need to talk woman to woman without lawyers involved. We can resolve this civilly." I agreed to meet her more out of curiosity than any hope of resolving anything. We met at a neutral coffee shop, a public place where I knew she couldn't make a scene. Andrea arrived punctually, dressed in a pearl gray suit that screamed money and power. She sat across from me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Look," she said, getting straight to the point, "let's be realistic. You don't know how to run a company. You have no business experience. In 6 months, you're going to ruin everything Oscar built. The company will collapse and everyone will lose, including you." I continued sipping my coffee in silence, letting her talk. "I have a proposal," she continued, leaning forward. "Give me operational control of the company. You can keep the properties with a generous amount of cash. Let's say $2 million. That's more than you ever dreamed of having. And we'll take care of the business. Everyone wins." I looked her straight in the eye. "And what does Julian gain in this?" I asked. "Because something tells me this isn't his idea." Andrea had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "Julian gets what's due to him as a son. The company his father built, the family legacy. It's only fair." I slowly shook my head. "What's fair is what Oscar decided. He knew exactly who you both were. He knew you only cared about the money. That's why he made the decision he made. Andrea, your facade of concern doesn't fool me. It never fooled me." Her face hardened. The gentle mask completely fell away. "You're making a mistake," she said in a cold voice. "In court, we're going to destroy you. We're going to prove you're a manipulator, an opportunist who took advantage of a sick man. When we're done with you, there won't be anything left of your precious reputation." I stood up, leaving money on the table to pay for my coffee. "Try it," I said. "I'll see you in court." I left that coffee shop feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Clarity, absolute determination. There were no more doubts, no more guilt. I was going to fight with everything I had. I was going to win not just for myself, but for Oscar, for Gilbert, for all the versions of myself that had been ignored and underestimated for decades. And so we arrive at the day of the trial, the moment I walked through those courtroom doors and saw Andrea roll her eyes when she saw me enter, the moment the judge stopped when he saw me, when his face changed from neutral to surprised, when he said those words that made the whole room tense up. "Wait, The accusations are against Ms. Davis, Veronica Davis. The judge took off his glasses and looked at me with renewed attention. Ms. Davis, he said, his voice containing something that hadn't been there seconds before. You're the lawyer, Veronica Davis, who handled the Martinez versus State case 3 years ago? It wasn't a question. It was an affirmation seeking confirmation. I nodded slightly. That's me, Your Honor. I watched the color drain from Andrea's face. I watched Julian lean toward his lawyer, whispering frantically. They didn't know. They never knew. To them, I'd always been just Mom, just Dad's wife, just the unimportant homemaker who cooked and cleaned. They never bothered to find out what I had done with my life after they stopped paying attention to me. They never asked. They never investigated. The Martinez case had been one of my biggest triumphs. A 60-year-old woman who had been defrauded by her own family, stripped of her pension and her home through fraudulent documents. I had taken the case pro bono. I had fought for 2 years against corporate lawyers with unlimited resources and had won. Not only did I recover everything they had stolen, but I managed to have those responsible criminally prosecuted. The case had been in all the legal newspapers. It had set important precedents. The judge was the same magistrate who had overseen that case. He remembered my work. He remembered my tenacity. He remembered how I had dismantled every defense argument with surgical precision, and now he saw me on the other side, being accused of exactly the same type of manipulation I had fought against years ago. The irony was so obvious I could almost taste it. Proceed, the judge finally said, though his tone had completely changed. There was no longer that bureaucratic neutrality. There was interest, curiosity, perhaps even anticipated respect for what he was about to witness. Julian's lawyer rose, clearly disconcerted by the exchange he had just witnessed. He began his opening argument with less confidence than he had probably planned. He spoke of a vulnerable woman who had been seduced by the promises of a rich man. He spoke of a loving son who only wanted to protect his father's legacy. He spoke of emotional manipulation, of taking advantage of a man on his sickbed. Every word was a carefully constructed lie designed to make me look like a villain. I listened expressionlessly, taking occasional notes, waiting for my turn. When Marcus stood up to present our defense, the atmosphere in the room changed. He had a presence that demanded attention, a voice that filled the space without needing to shout. Your Honor, he began, what we are witnessing here is not a case of manipulation. It is a case of consequences of decades of emotional neglect, of calls that only came when money was needed, of a mother who was treated like an ATM by her own son. He methodically presented the evidence. Phone records showing years of silence from Julian, interrupted only by requests for money. Bank transfers documenting more than $500,000 given to Julian and Andrea in loans that were never repaid, and testimonies from hospital staff confirming that I had been present at the hospital every day during Oscar's recovery, while Julian barely showed up once during weeks. Then came the video. The lights dimmed and Oscar's voice filled the room. I watched him on the screen, sitting in Ivan's office with that serious expression he wore when making important decisions. I heard his words, explaining exactly why he had made that decision, why I deserved that inheritance, why Julian needed to learn lessons that easy money had never taught him. When the video ended, there were tears in my eyes, but there were also tears in the eyes of some people in the audience. Julian's lawyer tried to discredit the video. He argued that Oscar had been on strong medication, that I could have been off camera instructing him what to say, that a man in his condition was vulnerable to manipulation. But Marcus was prepared. He presented the complete medical records, psychological evaluations done the same day as the video, confirming that Oscar was completely lucid, with no medication effects that could impair his judgment. Then came the testimonies. Employees from Oscar's company spoke about how I had visited the office during his recovery, how I had asked intelligent questions about operations and finances, how I had shown genuine interest in understanding the business I would eventually inherit. Oscar's personal accountant testified that he had been preparing me for months, teaching me about investments and management, ensuring I could handle the fortune responsibly. They even called some of my own clients. A woman who had been in a situation similar to mine testified about how I had fought for her, how I had recovered what her family had stolen. A man whose father had been unjustly declared incompetent spoke about my professional integrity, about how I had refused bribes and pressures to stay on the right side of justice. When it was time for closing arguments, Julian took the stand. His lawyer had advised him to show emotion, vulnerability, the pain of a son who had lost his father and was now also losing his inheritance. But Julian was not a good actor. His words sounded rehearsed, fake. "My father was my hero," he said, his voice attempting to break. "I always wanted to follow in his footsteps, continue his legacy, and he pointed toward me accusatorily, she stole that opportunity from me." Marcus demolished him in the cross-examination. "How many times did you visit your father in the hospital after his first heart attack?" he asked. Julian hesitated. "I don't know, several times." Marcus presented the hospital visitation records. "Once, Mr. Davis, you visited him exactly once in 3 weeks of hospitalization." Julian turned pale. "I was busy with work," he mumbled. "And how much money did your father loan you in the last 5 years?" Again, Julian hesitated. "I didn't keep exact track." Marcus smiled humorlessly. $500,000 documented in transfers that were never repaid. Do you call that a loan, or do you call that a subsidy for a lifestyle you couldn't sustain? The room was in absolute silence. Julian had no answer. He lowered his gaze in defeat and was excused from the stand. When it was my turn to testify, I walked up calmly. I swore to tell the truth and sat down, looking directly at the judge. Marcus asked me basic questions first, establishing my history, my sacrifice, my abandoned and then recovered career. Then he got to the important question. "Ms. Davis, did you manipulate your husband into changing his will in your favor?" "No," I replied, my voice firm and clear. "Oscar made that decision completely alone. I didn't even know he had changed his will until after his death. He told me days before he passed away, but by then it was already done. He explained his reasons, and I respected them because they were his reasons, not mine." Julian's lawyer attacked me in the cross-examination. He tried to make me look calculating, cold, opportunistic, but I had spent years in courtrooms. I knew how to remain calm under pressure. After 3 days of testimonies, evidence, and arguments, the judge announced he would deliver his verdict in 1 week. That week was eternal. I spent nights awake, reviewing every moment of the trial, wondering if I had done enough, if the truth had been clear enough. Marcus assured me we had won, that it was obvious to anyone who saw the evidence, but the fear persisted. On the day of the verdict, the room was packed. The judge entered with a serious, unflappable expression. After reviewing all the evidence presented, he began, "I have reached a clear conclusion. The will of Mr. Oscar Davis is completely valid. It was executed with full mental capacity, without coercion or undue manipulation. The plaintiff's allegations are unfounded and are dismissed in their entirety." I felt something inside me release, a weight I had been carrying for months finally lifting. The judge continued, "Furthermore," he said, looking directly at Julian, "this court observes that this case appears motivated not by justice, but by avarice. Mr. Davis, Sr. made a conscious decision based on years of observing his son's behavior. This court respects that decision." Julian and Andrea left the courtroom without looking at me. I watched them walk away. Their dreams of easy wealth destroyed, their true nature exposed before everyone. I felt no joy in their defeat. I only felt sadness for what we could have been and never were. That night, alone in the house that was now completely mine, I sat in the garden where I used to have coffee with Gilbert. I looked at the stars and felt his presence and Oscar's too. "Thank you," I whispered to the wind. Today, 2 years later, I manage Oscar's company with the help of competent managers. I created a foundation in Gilbert's memory that helps older women with legal cases they can't afford. I still take cases at my law firm, fighting for those who have no voice. Julian sent me a message 6 months ago. It just said sorry. I didn't reply. Some wounds are too deep. Some bridges are burned beyond reconstruction. Maybe someday we can talk, maybe not. But I learned that family is not who shares your blood. It is who shares your life. The legacy Gilbert and Oscar left me was not the money. It was the lesson that it is never too late to reclaim yourself.